welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. In digital trust infrastructure, there are rules that we talk about often. These rules, we often refer to them as governance or governance framework. And for folks, listeners of this podcast who are familiar with the trust over IP, talk about the trust over IP a little bit on here, and the trust over IP architecture. One of the core theses of the trust over IP architecture is that the interoperability of governance frameworks is just as important, if not more so, than the interoperability of technical protocols. And so I think the word interoperability is used in our day-to-day lingo. We talk about it all the time on different levels of the technical architecture, but why is that statement true in your opinion, that it's perhaps more important that we reach interoperability of governance frameworks? And as we're talking about this, might be helpful to kind of lay the ground on what are we talking about with governance frameworks?
Right. So thanks, by the way, for having me on this podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you and talk about a topic that maybe some of your listeners haven't focused on as much. It's because everyone loves the tech, but when we talk about rules and such, I don't know how exciting this might be for others. It's exciting for me because we live on a basis of rules. And we're looking at an ecosystem, a broader ecosystem that is global in nature and needs to be extensible between ecosystems. For example, if you get your driver's license that is issued to you by your local jurisdiction based on your ability to drive a vehicle, and follow through with the requirements to receive one of those credentials. That credential, in addition to just getting a driver's license, in most cases, and it's going to be more prevalent in the United States with the enforcement of the Real ID, is they check your citizenry. In addition to getting a driver's license, they check that you are a valid citizen. And that credential that's issued in an individual state in the United States or in a locality where you are globally is now used in another ecosystem, in an ecosystem, for example, to board a plane. And so the authorities that want to use that credential in another context, such as boarding a plane as someone, they have to have confidence in the TSA or the security infrastructure of the airport. They want to understand that the credential that you're offering as identification to get past the security line satisfies the context that they need, which is not if you could drive a car, but it is that you were validated on your citizenry, that there was a reasonable amount of steps taken to validate that you are who you say you are for the context of boarding a plane. And so how does that relate into a governance framework? Well, a governance framework describes the rules associated with issuing a credential. What steps have been taken? What identity proofing steps are required in order to issue that credential, and what steps are maintained that you maintain that credential securely, and what are the rights associated with all the participants that ensure that when I validate that digital driver's license, that I would get a result that I have confidence in. And so the idea of carrying forward that set of rules attached to that driver's license is very important for the interoperability of trust. So we look at, what are the rules associated with the issuance of a credential for one context to be used to have assurance in other contexts globally. And because we're dealing with a global infrastructure, the set of rules around the extensibility of what went into creating a credential on one end and being able to accept it for another purpose defines the requirement really to have governance frameworks associated with the exchange of these credentials.
In use cases or within ecosystems where we're trying to create digital transformation on something that exists in the physical world today, and this is a way, when talking about digital trust, that I often explain it to folks, is that the way that we prove certain identity attributes about ourselves in the physical world, for example, using a government issued ID to rent a car or to get a Costco card or whatever the use case is, this is what we're now able to do in a digital way, which was not really possible before this dual infrastructure of, yeah, we have privacy preserving interoperable technology that's based on standards and blah, 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 layered with the governance there as well. In these use cases I'm talking about, you're basically taking an existing use case in the physical world and replicating it digitally. Is the same thing true for taking the existing governance in the physical world and then just replicating that or codifying that? How do you see that going digital?
You know, I agree that we're taking some of the in-person activities and we're digitizing it before we're digitalizing it. You know, so digitizing it is just, you know, changing this physical cards that we have into a digital format. But we're going, I think, a step further, because when, you know, there is, you know, when you get your driver's license, there really isn't a set of rules established of what went into, you know, giving you your physical driver's license. It hasn't been, you know, defined at that way, and it needs to be. So we're actually going to another degree of assurance around the issuance of these credentials, because in this new, once we, you know, we have a number of jurisdictions or individuals or corporations making claims using cryptography, you know, then more people are going to be issuing credentials that we use on a day-to-day basis. And you know, we all need to be against a minimum set of rules, you know, because when you have physical cards in your wallet, you only have a certain amount of things that have been just, it makes sense for these ecosystems to create physical cards, whether it's, you know, health insurance cards or it's driver's licenses or it's credit cards. But in this new, taking advantage of the new technology, you're going to see many more variations of claims being made by issuers that are going to be cryptographically embedded in credentials that get exchanged and have the need to be verified through this ecosystem.
I completely agree that the different types of transactions that are happening and will continue to happen more and more digitally using what we're talking about here are going to be much more than what are in the physical world, just because you're able to chop attributes here and there, stick them together from different credentials, use different levels of privacy when you're presenting it. Like there's just there's going to be an explosion of different types of exchanges digitally versus what happens, let's call it verifiably, in the physical world. If that is true, and I think we believe that is true, and there's going to be that many more exchanges, that many more use cases. You talked earlier about your governance needs to cover when your use cases or your credentials are being used in other ecosystems. If there's going to be that many more exchanges and credentials going everywhere, does it become a little bit tough to set governance across an ecosystem or between ecosystems? How should people think about that? And then is it really, do I create governance on the edge as an entity, as an organization, as a verifier, as an entity in the verifiable trust triangle, or does there need to be governance that across different interactions? How do you look at that with the complexity of the transactions that are happening and will continue to happen?
Governance needs to be fairly transparent to the users. So governance comes in place when there is a decision to use a set of credentials for a context, and that is in the planning of the exchange of digital credentials. And so that needs to be planned. It needs to go through a risk assessment. It needs to determine, are we looking at credentials in the right context for the use of a population within an ecosystem to use. And once we have that, certainly we want to have the audit trail that at any individual, because we're now placing the control of the artifacts of your digital life closer to the holder, and we want to empower that holder to understand what processes and what controls and what reliance holders can have on the usage of these credentials. However, that should not be necessarily the first thing that people use. They should hope at some point, once we have the infrastructure deployed globally and people are using governance in this way, it should be transparent to the users, but very much in the forefront when contexts of usages are deployed.
So if we take a step back and talk about trust for a second, how do you look at trust? Is trust a technical concept? Is trust a human concept? How do we think about trust in this whole framework?
Well, in the Trust Over IP Foundation, I'm so glad, first of all, that we've named the organization with the word trust in it. We actually did a forensic look at trust. And if you look at the principles of SSI, and we also came up with a document that talks about the design principles for the Trust Over IP Foundation. And we have a number of different trust principles. You can determine if it starts really as trust is a human concept. Okay, it's a perception, and individuals, just like they perceive risk, and maybe it goes down to individual DNA, people have a different risk tolerance. They also have a different tolerance of trust. I may have to take extra steps in order to quote unquote trust someone or transaction, whereas someone else would take much less steps in order to trust someone or trust an activity. And so obviously that is a way that bad actors in the world have really attacked the digital infrastructure by attacking trust principles. We live today, and that's the problem, and what we're trying to fix is we live in an internet environment where we don't have true identity. So we're dealing with anonymous people, and anonymous people right now, the ability to trust someone anonymously is too high for a variety of sets of asset transfer transactions. We want to do more things on the internet, but we lack the ability to trust the authenticity of the interactions that we're doing in order to enable those transactions to happen. Now, what's reasonable? There is a clutch point around trust for a swath of the population. So at some point, you want to be able to get enough confidence in a context to do a transaction. And that's what I'd call the kind of a clutch point of trust. And the clutch point of trust varies depending on the value of the transaction that you're doing. If you're going to transfer $10,000 to an individual, you want to have a lot more trust that the money that you're sending to that individual is and represents and truly is who who that person conveys that they are, as opposed to, I'm going to hand somebody my gym membership to use for a day. I don't, someone just asked me, what would be the worst thing that can happen around that? And so, I live in a world where I review what the risks are of transactions and try to enact governance musts or rules associated to mitigate risks of certain transactions. Now, for example, one thing that I've just learned, there's going to be a lot of activity in the next year around rules associated with digital wallets. Not just wallets for specific purposes, but the general purpose wallet that has standards that we can use for a variety of digital asset transactions. And so it was conveyed very early on that the control of that smart wallet in your phone will have a high degree of assurance that you are who you say you are, and that you control the private information that is controlled in that. And because we don't know, we want to make sure that that container has a high degree of trust for the highest level of transaction that you would do digitally. And so, so that's where the variability around trust is played. At times, you're going to enact a highest degree of trust for maybe lower trust applications, but if that container is used for the highest degree of transactions, that's what it needs to be rated for.
So you talked a bit about having different levels of trust based on the risk and the context in your interaction. Trust seems like something that's difficult to quantify. What are some ways or mechanisms that we go about quantifying trust, if it's even possible as a human concept?
I'd like to say that I live in an accountable context, and I do believe that trust is built, when you say what you're going to do and you do what you're going to say, and people, gain confidence that if you make commitments, so I'm a commitment-based person, you make commitments and then you actually follow through and demonstrate those commitments, that creates trust individually and, in a larger context, it creates trust in ecosystems. So if a tech player or an ecosystem has set aside against certain rules that say that participants in an ecosystem has to abide by certain rules and commit to following them, and commit to the degree that they could even invite independent third parties to evaluate that those commitments, that those assurances that you're meeting a certain set of rules are done, then that is how trust is created in the marketplace. And that's the trust engine that's being developed around the governance side of the trust over IP stack. Is it starts with a set of rules. We can't play a game, the game of life, digital life, without a set of rules. You can't, it's great that someone invented an American football, but until we establish the rules of American football, we couldn't enjoy American football. We'd just be throwing the ball around, and we couldn't enjoy it to the degree that society enjoys that. And that's similar to this. Well, we can't, we have the tech, but we can't, enjoy the tech in a fair playing field unless we have rules that people are demonstrating that they are ascribing to. And when organizations subscribe to certain sets of rules and there is accountability amongst those players that are subscribing to those rules, trust is created in the marketplace. We're not creating new rules around that. That's the way it has been, since the beginning of of computer technology. There's a whole variety of different trust schemes that we operate and recognize in the marketplace, and we're just extending it to this new ecosystem set.
Is the word accountability the keyword here? You used it, and it made me think of trust. I guess sometimes is established and looked at differently through kind of a reputation that you have, or it's built over time, right? So sometimes you need to do a lot of stuff or build up confidence to be able to have a certain trust level to be able to do something you couldn't do previously. So perhaps these are rules that you would create. But it made me think of just a silly example. But when I was in France in October in a very small village, one grocery store, one butcher, one restaurant type of thing. And so it's a very small community. They see the same people coming in every day type of thing. There's a different level of trust in these interactions between these people versus in a big city like Paris, for example, when people are walking in every day, because you don't know if you'll ever see these people again. And one of the things that happened, and I thought was quite cool, was there was a gentleman that walked into a grocery store. He had picked up a few items. He got to the cash and he was about to pay, and he realized that he forgot his wallet. And the cashier was just like, and then no problem, you come back later, come back tomorrow, whatever. And they gave the goods and then let the person go out. And I was like, wow, like that's the type of thing that would only happen kind of in a small community. There's trust built in, but it's because I would think that there's accountability, coming back to that key word, right? Because if you were to just not come back and try to steal this from the grocery store, you wouldn't be able to come back again, versus in a big city, or you would lose a lot of trust there, versus in a big city, like you don't know if you'll ever see the person again. It doesn't matter. There's 100 other grocery stores. Doesn't really matter. Is accountability, and it's a funny example, but is accountability really the key thing in building a rule system?
It is. But I love your example, because a lot of people live in smaller towns because their personal interaction creates trust. You know the owner of the store, and you know the people that go to the store, and it's your personal knowledge that gives you satisfaction. And you know that these people are accountable because they come to the store every day. You can almost count on them, coming to the store. However, as you alluded to, in a big city like Paris, that's what the internet is. The internet is filled with tons of people you don't know, millions and millions of people that you don't know, that come into your sphere expecting something of you. And then the question comes down in your mind is how confident am I in the person that's approaching me to determine whether they are, approaching me and asking me something sincerely, that they really, what is their intent, and that is a challenge right now in the internet. And I think it really happened, it accelerated during the pandemic, because then we were forced to look at, our interactions with people really through computer interactions. And then we realized how insufficient it is. And people were clamoring to go out to the local small, grocery store and interacting with people, because they missed out on the confidence of people's trusted interactions with them. And that's what we're trying to put in globally. We want to have more confidence to be able to not misstep, because right now a misstep in our digital society can cost millions. Someone can take over your computer from ransomware, or bilk you out of certain transactions, or go after certain funds that you have. So, we need to float a considerable amount of boats in order to get to a level of trust that we could allow higher value transactions to occur.
Or transactions that just can't occur at all today.
Right.
I'd written the first paper last year, just an introduction on digital trust, and I've been trying to push it a little bit further recently and just asking more questions. And they're mostly governance questions that you get into at that point, right? Because it's like we all know the verifiable credential trust triangle. We all know issuer issues to holder, holder presents to verifier. It's verifiable. There's cryptographic trust in here in the presentation of a credential proposal. There's also cryptographic trust baked into the authentication that happens between two entities that are in a specific interaction. But even on that layer of cryptographic trust, to actually establish cryptographic trust, you need to trust the system, or you need to trust the governance that's in place. And so that's where we see a lot of initiatives that are happening throughout the world where, I don't know, let's use an example, at least at a country level, where there's data registries or these utilities that are being built up with governance in it, so that when a credential is verified, you could actually verify that it was issued by a government entity, which it was supposed to be issued by. There needs to be governance on this network that they're building in. But then the next questions you start asking, it's like, well, okay, how do I know that this government entity is actually the owner of this identifier? Because anyone could just go and issue any type of credential, whatever, if it's not within a specific governance framework. So you get into an authentication question, which has a whole governance aspect to it. And then once you solve that authentication, where I could say, yeah, okay, I do have confidence that the party has been accurately represented in a specific claim. The next question is, are they actually authorized to do what they're doing, which is kind of an additional layer. And this is like we're moving from authentication to authorization. This is another layer of governance. And so it feels though, and we've said it earlier, like the technology works, the technology is there. We're at a point where it's just about defining the frameworks, and once the frameworks are in place, let the technology run, let the use cases run, adoption will happen itself. It seems like the big impediment is the lack of governance, the lack of controls that are in place.
It's interesting, the discussions around governance are starting to happen now, that the tech, we seem to see the end in near. You know, we know what we need to do around the tech, and we can see that if we all get together and we put down our individual proprietary needs and come together collectively, that we can create the interoperability that's needed to get the tech right. Now, here's the thing about the tech, though. So, and I've been a cryptographic auditor for the last 17 years. And so here's the thing about the tech that people don't realize or focus on is I can cryptographically sign a lie. Okay. And people don't realize, they say, oh, if it's done cryptographically, it's got to be absolutely bona fide. Well, the tech says that there's a mathematical relationship between a private and a public key. Absolutely. And we can rely on that. And however, when an entity signs something, we need to have confidence when they sign a claim, they actually have the basis to sign it. And actually we have to have assurance that the person that, or the entity that we think is making the claim actually is making the claim. And how do we do that? That's through the governance. We need to have comfort and satisfaction around the risk of an entity that's not the entity that it is presenting, signing something against, they're misrepresenting themselves when they digitally sign a claim on a verifiable credential or an identity artifact. And we also need to have confidence that an individual, when getting a credential, has actually attained the rights associated with that credential. That's also something that's not that's not going to be solved with the tech. That's going to be solved with the governance. So there are today, individuals getting diplomas from universities that maybe didn't achieve those requirements and get a diploma, physical diploma. That's not going to change in the digital world. We have to ensure that there's proper governance, that when a digital diploma gets issued, that that person has attained the rights to get that digital diploma or has passed the requirements of a driver's test in order to get a driver's license, and all of these other things that absolutely doesn't go away with the tech. I mean, you need to have those things in place. And there needs to be confidence associated with the rights of these digital credentials, in addition to just relying upon the technology.
Everything we're talking about here really summarizes itself of you're just trying to manage risk. And a lot of things in life, if you look at it with that perspective, could make you quite successful. Just trying to avoid risk. If you avoid the big risks, you'll be okay. You'll get hit here and there with stuff, but if you avoid the big one, you'll keep chugging along. We often talk about, then if I want to manage risk, I have to have some level of certainty or some level of assurance about different decisions or different transactions when going into it. I played a bit of poker in my life, and that's one of the learnings from poker is just you're just managing risk based on your stack in a specific situation, and you're trying to see what the odds are and if you should partake or not. It would be interesting to talk a little bit about the whole concept of assurance and how that is used as kind of a measure in different frameworks to manage risk.
So the way, I believe, and we've developed within the Trust Over IP Foundation, is the way to, to start with assurance is you need to really identify risk to an acceptable level. And so risk assessment isn't necessarily what people like to do on a daily basis, because when you do a risk assessment in an environment, you're really thinking through all of the bad things that can happen. And you need to look at, okay, if someone is an imposter to issue a certain credential, what's the likelihood of that happening? And if it does happen, what's the impact, at an ecosystem level around that? So there is some kind of, human determination around what, a risk and impact is in order to come up with a scheme for assurance to reasonably address the risk, okay? Because there's a cost associated with governance, okay? And when we established the internet, we had this whole infrastructure, ready to move out around certification authorities. We were going to have trust anchors that were going to be accountable, that were going to, be able to exact, certificates that would be accountable and mitigate, transactions that were going in. And it was deemed too costly. Okay, so we started out the internet without without identity in the payload of trust of the TCP IP stack, and we did not have trusted third parties to manage accountability and trust. And now we're trying to backfill that after 25 years. We're trying to create that. And so once we have a risk assessment, we determined, okay, what are the steps? What if the accountable parties, for example, issuers, what are the rules that they have to invoke as a collective in order to give assurance into the marketplace? Are we going to ensure that all issuers of identity credentials do a certain minimum level of proofing that people are who they say they are when they receive, and prior to receiving an identity artifact? And so that proofing process, which is now being accredited in certain jurisdictions, is now a means of creating that accountability. And now you could have the rules, but if you don't have a scheme in place to ensure that issuers go through either an assertion and an attestation process, they have to say, yes, we are making sure that we're checking a variety of different third-party artifacts before we issue a credential of identity to someone. And if not, we have to make sure that everyone in the ecosystem is playing by the same set of rules, because if one player is missing it, then we haven't mitigated the risk we have a hole in the risk. And it needs to be addressed. And then the ecosystem needs to review and say, what do we do about players that are not playing against the rules? And so, as we look at kind of a holistic, larger scale ecosystem that's driven by governments and industries, we're looking at a lot of participants that have to play by a common set of rules, and so that collectively we can build trust to the level that we need to for the transactions that we're trying to do.
Yeah, the whole conversation, or when you mentioned that there's a cost to governance, that is interesting. So it's just always to assess if it's worth investing more to get the trust up. You talked about the internet a bit, and I think we all agree the level of trust on the internet today is low, and at the end of the day, we're just trying to increase it a bit. And it's going to make a drastic difference. It's kind of like the 80-20 rule, and improve it a little bit, 20%, and it'll make it 80% better type of thing, if we want to use that analogy. And kind of relates to the whole cost discussion as well, because it gets back to the use case, but then also it makes me wonder if, and I've struggled with this on projects in past years where we tried to create ecosystem solutions. So you have different parties around the table. It's tough to get people all around the table at the same time from different organizations or different sides. They all have conflicting interests. They all have conflicting priorities. So to get folks around the table, to get them to get aligned on something, is sometimes it feels like you're herding cats, and it could be difficult. Do you feel like that is an impediment sometimes, just looking at an ecosystem approach, that you need to get everyone on the same page, playing by the same playbook, following the same rules? That seems like a costly process in itself. And are there ways where you could just reuse? One of the aspects I like about the technology is there's a lot of composability with it. Once something's done, once something's plugged in, you could just start using it for another use case. It just works. Is the same thing true with governance, where maybe if it's tough to get people around the table, and would love to hear thoughts based on your experience there, but could you reduce the friction, or reduce the effort, reduce the cost by reusing what's been already developed, or existing frameworks that work?
Yes. And the answer, and that's the reason why, I made a personal and then brought my organization involved in a Linux Foundation project, because of the need to move in the open source arena. And so going back to the origination of your question, the challenge exists very similar to when the internet first started. In the internet, when they first started, for those that were around, we had a set of 3 or 4, maybe an oligopoly of controlled, of garden walled ecosystems that you would, be involved in: AOL, Prodigy, and CompuServe. And we were limited in what we can do in those ecosystems, and all the players that were involved in that was focused on, necessarily profit motive. They wanted to contain you and keep you involved in that particular walled garden. And, the problem is bigger, or the need or the value associated of that was bigger than just those walled gardens. I mean, we needed an we needed an email protocol that if I was a Prodigy email person, I needed to be able to send a message to you, and you were on CompuServe. And so we needed interoperability standards, because, we're not going to be living in the AOL world all our lives. I mean, we wanted to break out and create a global, interoperable society. And the challenge exists even today as we move, to today's society. It's very similar. We have technology leaders in our world that are motively driven. And we have jurisdictions that are looking not for profit motive, looking for fairness, looking for inclusion, looking to minimize harms to a set of population, to create opportunity to those that are not involved in previous generations of the internet, to add value associated to to our society. And so those I'd say competing motivations need to come together. They need to come together because the problem that we're trying to solve is bigger than an individual profit motive, and needs to, and it's also extensible beyond individual jurisdictions. And so we do need to work together for a global innovation. And as we look at how do we all work together, there is a concept of reuse and open source. And I do believe that there's opportunity in the world to make money in this emerging infrastructure, specifically around use cases. But the global interoperable foundation needs to be open source. Okay. Now, if we send a message, we go to websites and all that, we don't pay to go to websites. Okay, we rely upon a free infrastructure that is bound within and made available to us. And so the foundational interoperability needs to be free, and it needs to be in a way that we all can operate and build upon it, and everyone will get their piece. Jurisdictions will get their piece, and high-tech companies will get their piece in investing in it. But we need to share the foundational open source building blocks of and reuse to exchange documentation. So I'll give you a perfect example. There was a presentation made by the Secretary of Commerce in Rhode Island at the Global Hyperledger Forum. And she's a great proponent of what the work has started many years ago in Estonia, and said we want to advance the use of digital credentials. So she created a CPA. I'm a CPA, love that. Created a CPA credential, and how she did that was that she used open source code that was available in Hyperledger, and she was able to do it faster. And she knew that the code was tried and true because it was tested in a number of use cases. And so we build upon that, and we all contribute and improve upon open source code so that we can all create the foundational interoperability layer to a degree that we can then all make money and achieve our individual objectives.
There were early successful nation state digital ID programs. You referred to Estonia, you referred to some good work happening. I believe talking about Liz Tanner in Rhode Island.
Yes.
I was lucky to see a really cool presentation from a couple of guys from the government of Singapore back at IAW just this past week. I know you're very familiar with other programs that are happening, getting more involved in Canada. Shout out, Canada's doing some tremendous work, both on the technical and governance side of things. Very lucky to be a part of this community and spend time with people here. Great stuff happening in Canada, great stuff happening in the EU. Are all of these programs, although they're different, like you can't launch the same digital identity program in the Canadian market or the American market that you can in Estonia or Singapore for different reasons, which we could talk about. But were some of the advancements that they were able to do and governance that they were able to create for their programs, are these things reusable for other countries that are saying, hey, I can't do the exact same thing, but there maybe are certain components that I could reuse? Could you find composability in that regard?
Yes. So what, I see that there is a core base of governance tenets that are probably going to be in place in every jurisdiction, in every environment, whether it's in industry. And then you have, a certain spin to it that becomes proprietary or very germane to the way a jurisdiction operates. whether it's their government, their philosophy, their such. And so what we're finding, for example, there are accreditation models that, one has been in place in the United States, and there's one that's developing in the UK, and in Canada. There's a variety of different ones that are popping up, based on the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. The core is around starting, as we're seeing, is trying to have governance around, proving that a credential is issued to a person that actually can prove they are who they say they are. And that's so that identity proofing is, the core tenets of that is apps. If we're dealing with digital identity, that's going to happen globally in different flavors, but it's going to be, that's the core, topic of how do we get comfort that a digital representation, or, we give the hands to a credential that can be used to make claims, that's tied to a human, that is representing, authenticity, surrounding that person. And so that's happening. And then once I get that credential, how can I use it? How can I authenticate that I'm the one that's actually using that credential? So those two tenets are rising, the first ones, and that will be, the first, I'd say the first couple that will likely go in any jurisdiction, because those are the core, risks and controls that need to be identified in any scheme. Now, how that applies in different jurisdictions, that may be, based on, history of how this was done, in person by a jurisdiction. So there'll be flavors of how each jurisdiction addresses that. Also, maybe their risk tolerance. They'll allow, more. They want more documents to be conveyed and proven before a credential is issued, or maybe less. So there'll be some toggles and switches around how much to use based on levels of assurance for certain transactions that would be used with those credentials. And so those are the core that are starting up, and as we get to more verifiable credentials, we'll want to know that the payload inside a credential, a claim, is actually legitimate. And that goes into many different types of flavors, but the table of contents around that is fairly static. And we've created that actually in the Trust Over IP Foundation through the governance meta model specification. And governments are looking and using that table of contents, because that's, as you had mentioned prior in prior question, what can we reuse? And in the Trust Over IP Foundation, we want reuse all over the world. That's one of the initiatives and the purposes, the reasons why we've created. We are looking for reuse. We're looking, to create, the foundation that we can all operate on the same page.
When you mentioned earlier that there was a lack of verifiability of identities, or it was too expensive to put those steps into place on the internet at origination, that decision was made on purpose for a specific reason. I really am, I read it a few times and I'm continuing to wrap my head and to think about it, but within the Trust Over IP, the new technology architecture model that bases itself on the hourglass model that is used for the internet today, where you have a spanning protocol in the middle, in kind of the neck of the hourglass, which in the internet is IP or IPv4, and it's a very thin protocol. It allows for communication to happen, and there are different specialized fatter protocols that are above it that are able to leverage that. I really like the enhancement in just visualizing the hourglass model compared to, not that I didn't like the previous dual stack model, but sometimes perhaps led to confusion with different technology implementations or even the use case itself. We're now seeing the hourglass model used for digital trust, it's kind of makes it easier for me to see, yeah, okay, I understand what protocols could really fit into the neck. It makes it easier to understand the separation of wallets and agents. It makes it easier to think about use cases outside of just credential exchange. There's a lot of good things that have been going in my head there. So as this new technical specification, and I would ask everyone that finds this interesting to go look into this and to provide your own thoughts and reflection on it. But in the previous version 1, the dual stack architecture, there was that governance layer. Do you see that governance layer applying across the hourglass model? Is there a good way of depicting that? Where does the whole framework of governance against technology go with this new hourglass model?
The hourglass model was needed on the technical side to create, expansive interoperability. We're dealing with other attributes around speed and identification. How are we going to communicate at a protocol level? Now, I look at the protocol level from a term of risk is, can I intercept certain things within the protocol? And I expect from a governance and a risk management, professional, that the protocol cannot, that the tenets associated with the communication, maintain its integrity. And so I would challenge, and I tend to go into the technical stack working group meetings. I kind of hover in and I make once in a while make message about are we addressing the risk appropriately? And that's something that has to pass the smell test. But I think initially the hourglass was meant really for to define how we could transform the payload, the communication vehicles, so that we're all operating in a fast way, in a way that we can get all of the pieces of information that we need to add identity and the rights and transactions to actually happen. So there are certain things that happen really at a transport layer. There's certain things that happen in the wallet layer. Some things happen down, at the data layer. So we're trying still, to figure out, okay, what is needed at different layers of the communication in order to work out, mitigate, risk at the layer that they're dealing with. And there will be governance still at every layer, because those questions need to be addressed. Where is the risk associated? If you have a governance protocol that, deals with mitigation of imposters, can it be, is there a risk at the communication layer? And if there is risk, how are we mitigating it? So there may be technical protocol, steps and requirements that are enacted in the technology stack that would contribute to risk mitigation on the governance side. And I can't tell you exactly if that's happening yet. Because we just have a reference architecture, we haven't exacted exactly how we're going to implement that reference architecture. But I can tell you that reference architecture is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I hope that, instead of just fighting over it, we could look at it and see how we can make that operational.
So we've talked a little bit about public sector. One of the areas that I think is an area that needs to continue to be explored is how public and private sector need to work together. And again, maybe there's some learnings we could take from other digital ID programs. Different countries are on different points in their life cycle there. But what role does public and private sector together need to play in the development of governance frameworks for national digital ID programs? And then the third entity here, we talk about there needs to be governance across the internet, or it's kind of and the internet is what we use for all of these transactions anyway today. And so how do you see this ecosystem of three entities, public sector, broadly speaking, private sector, and internet? What needs to happen? Who should be working on what? How could there be more collaboration? I'd be interested to hear your point of view on that.
The way the internet operates today is, we have ICANN, which is dealing with, addressable names of websites and such, and they drive, the interoperability, and so that all individuals can access the places that they need to do. And there is some, global governance around that. I don't know if there will continue to be, global governance associated with it. There might, but we're not there yet. We're still trying to get to even jurisdictional and industry, ecosystems, and then figure individually, we're trying to, how do we exchange within an ecosystem? And then we try to figure out, okay, how do we work the interoperability between ecosystems? And then the third aspect will be, okay, is there a need for an oversight around, common standards on how we all operate? I believe that we're starting to map out the architecture associated with the end game, okay? So I do believe that governance will be a place. There will be trust registries around issuers and verifiers. There will be common interoperability among smart wallets. We're moving towards that. And so, in essence, companies are now looking at, how do I make money in this new infrastructure? And there will be money to be made, okay? And so at the end of the day, the governments are going to be looking at other aspects that they will be requiring tech companies and for-profit companies to make, such as you better have private info, you better maintain a degree of privacy, you better be somewhat inclusive, and make sure that we're not, exacting, taking away rights to a swath of population that should have right to participate, and other tenets, principles that they care about for the benefit of their societies. And so I believe that tech companies that can see both sides of the fence, that can see how they could advance the technology to demonstrate that they have built a better mousetrap and are satisfying the concerns of ecosystem jurisdictions, will be successful in the future. And because they already realize, and we're already challenging tech companies, that the ones that are going to operate, 5-10 years in the future, better be better corporate citizens globally and meet a certain level of standards of personal rights, because we're entering, if we get this successful, we're entering a world where individual transactions and rights and the exchange of personal assets are going to be more in play. And you better play by a higher degree of rules if you want to be profitable and be able to thrive in jurisdictions.
I think we've been able to answer the core thesis of why potentially interoperability of governance frameworks is just as or more important than technology interoperability. Scott, thank you so much for doing this with me today. It was a real fascinating conversation, and I'm going to learn a lot just from re-listening to this. So thank you.
I've enjoyed my conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.